On a crisp morning in Central City, the sun had just begun its ascent, painting golden streaks across the towering buildings that loomed over the streets below. Long shadows stretched across the pavement, weaving through the flurry of activity as the city stirred awake. The air buzzed with the symphony of urban life, car horns blaring in impatient bursts, distant sirens wailing faintly, and the hum of conversations blending into a chaotic harmony. People darted through their routines. Some clutched steaming coffee cups as they hurried to offices. Others tugged leashes as their dogs sniffed the sidewalks. The neighborhood pulsed with vitality, a living, breathing entity fueled by the energy of its inhabitants. Amid this vibrant chaos walked Elijah Brooks, a striking figure in his mid-30s whose calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the frenetic pace around him. Dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, the fabric hugging his frame just right, he moved with an effortless grace. His polished shoes tapped a steady rhythm against the concrete, each step a quiet declaration of purpose. Elijah didn't demand attention. It simply gravitated toward him, drawn by the unspoken confidence that radiated from his very being. He was the sort of man who could silence a room without raising his voice, his presence a subtle force that lingered in the minds of those who passed him by. He had just left Millie's Diner, a cozy little spot he visited whenever his schedule allowed. The staff there adored him, knew him by name, and always greeted him with warm smiles. His order never varied: scrambled eggs fluffy as clouds, crisp turkey bacon, and a small bowl of fresh fruit arranged with care. As he savored his last bite that morning, he'd exchanged a few kind words with the waitress, a woman named Clara whose laughter always brightened his day. Now, with breakfast behind him, he approached his car, a sleek black sedan gleaming under the morning light, parked neatly along the curb. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a familiar vibration that pulled a faint smile to his lips. Fishing it out, he saw a text from his mother. "Don't forget dinner tonight, Eli. 6 sharp." His heart warmed at the thought of her bustling around the kitchen, the smell of her cooking filling the house. Family was his anchor, the steady thread that kept him grounded. He typed a quick reply, "Wouldn't miss it, Ma," before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Just as his key hovered over the lock, a prickling sensation crept up his spine. He glanced up to see 2 police officers striding toward him, their boots striking the pavement with purpose. Their eyes locked onto him, sharp and unyielding, like hawks zeroing in on prey. Elijah didn't recognize them. New faces, perhaps, rotated into the precinct, but their stares carried a weight that set his nerves on edge. He'd grown up navigating moments like this, taught by his father to tread carefully, especially as a black man, in a world quick to judge. "Stay calm, son. Keep your head. Don't give him a reason." Those words, etched deep into his soul, guided him now as he straightened his posture and met their approach with composure. "Excuse me, sir," one of them barked, his voice cutting through the morning din. Elijah turned fully to face them, his phone still in hand, his expression open but guarded. The officer's badge glinted in the sunlight. Carter, it read. Behind him stood his partner, Nelson, a stocky man with a hand resting casually near his holster, his fingers twitching as if itching for action. "Can I see some ID?" Carter's tone was clipped, edged with a hostility that offered no room for pleasantries. Elijah's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady, a smooth baritone that betrayed none of the unease flickering within. "Yes, officer. May I ask why?" He studied Carter's face, hard lines, a jaw clenched tight, eyes that gleamed with something unreadable. Nelson shifted his weight, his silence louder than words, a coiled spring ready to snap. Elijah knew his rights, knew he hadn't done a damn thing to warrant this, but he also knew the stakes. One wrong move, one misstep, and this could spiral into something ugly. Carter's lips twitched into a smirk, a venomous little curl that sent a chill through Elijah's bones. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." The words dripped with condescension, as if Elijah were a child caught in a lie. A spark of frustration flared in Elijah's chest, but he smothered it, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said, his tone measured, "but I'd still like to know why you need it." He handed over his driver's license, his fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Nelson's eyes darted to the card, then back to Elijah, his posture stiffening as if bracing for trouble. Carter snatched the ID, scanning it with a look of cold indifference. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his voice laced with accusation. Elijah's brows knitted together, confusion mingling with a growing sense of dread. "I'm just heading to my car," he replied, gesturing toward the sedan. "Is there a problem?" Carter ignored him, firing off another question like a bullet. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Elijah said, his patience thinning but his tone still even. "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" Carter's gaze snapped up, locking with Elijah's, and for a fleeting moment something flickered in those hard eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or a flicker of doubt. Then the smirk returned, sharper now. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He'd heard this script before, too many times to count. A black man in a nice suit, walking in a decent neighborhood, suddenly transformed into a suspect. It was a tired, ugly tale, one that never failed to ignite a quiet rage deep within him. But he swallowed it down, keeping his face neutral. "I see," he said carefully. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to get to my car and head to work." Carter stepped closer, his broad frame looming, his posture shifting from authoritative to outright menacing. "What kind of work do you do?" he pressed, his eyes boring into Elijah's. "I'm a lawyer," Elijah answered, his voice unwavering despite the tension coiling in his muscles. "I've got a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." The revelation seemed to throw Carter off balance, his smirk faltering for a heartbeat. A lawyer? Elijah could almost hear the gears grinding in the officer's mind, recalculating. But the surprise vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a sneer. "A lawyer, huh? You don't say." Nelson, who'd been a silent shadow until now, finally broke his quiet, his voice gruff and skeptical. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car?" Elijah's heart thudded against his ribs, a drumbeat of warning. He could feel the situation teetering on a knife's edge, ready to tip into chaos. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer," he said, forcing calm into every syllable. "You're welcome to check, but I'd rather you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Carter's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. "You don't get to decide how we do our job," he snapped. "Step away from the car." Elijah froze, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong, not a single thing, but the air crackled with danger, and he knew compliance might be his only shield. His father's voice echoed again. "Stay smart, Eli. Stay alive." "All right," he said softly, raising his hands just enough to show he meant no threat. He took a slow step back, his polished shoes scuffing the pavement. Carter moved in, his hand now gripping the baton at his hip, his intent clear as day. Then, without warning, the world tilted. Carter's hand shot out, seizing Elijah's arm and wrenching it behind his back with brutal force. Pain lanced through Elijah's shoulder, a white-hot jolt that stole his breath. He gasped, stunned by the suddenness of it, as Nelson lunged forward, grabbing his other arm and forcing him down. His knees slammed into the concrete, the impact jarring his bones, and he bit back a cry. "Hey! What are you doing?" he protested, struggling to keep his voice steady despite the agony radiating through him. He wasn't fighting back, couldn't, wouldn't, but the officers handled him like a rabid animal. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Carter said, his voice cold as steel as he snapped cuffs around Elijah's wrists. The metal bit into his skin, tight and unyielding, and Elijah's mind reeled. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted a thing. He'd complied, answered their questions, kept his cool even as they'd baited him. But here he was, face pressed to the gritty pavement, the weight of their knees pinning him down, and a sickening realization settling in. This wasn't about justice. This was power, raw, unchecked, and wielded without mercy. As the cuffs clicked shut, Elijah's thoughts spun wildly. He pictured his mother waiting at home, her smile fading when he didn't show up for dinner. He thought of his clients, depending on him to fight for them in court. And he thought of the lesson this moment screamed loud and clear. When power is abused, when prejudice festers unchecked, the innocent pay the price. But Elijah Brooks was no ordinary man, and soon, Carter and Nelson would learn just how monumental their reckoning would be. The air was thick with tension as the scene unfolded on the bustling street, a chaotic symphony of shouts and murmurs rising like a tide. Elijah Brooks stood at the center of it all, his heart pounding in his chest, though his face remained a mask of deliberate calm. The officers, Carter and Nelson, had already decided his fate the moment their eyes landed on him, guilty in their minds without a shred of evidence. Their hands gripped his arms with a force that felt more like vengeance than protocol, and Elijah could sense the storm brewing around him as the commotion rippled outward, drawing the attention of those nearby. Across the street, perched on her weathered balcony, Mrs. Martha Perkins clutched the railing with trembling hands. Her silver hair fluttered in the breeze as she stared down at the unfolding injustice, her wrinkled face contorted with a mix of horror and fury. She'd known Elijah for years, seen him walking these streets with a quiet dignity, always offering a polite nod or a warm smile. To her, he was no stranger, no threat, just a good man caught in a nightmare. "What are you doing to him?" she cried out, her voice quivering but sharp, cutting through the clamor below. "He didn't do anything wrong!" Her words were a desperate plea, fueled by the outrage of a woman who'd lived long enough to recognize the bitter taste of unfairness. Not far off, a young couple paused mid-stride, their golden retriever tugging at its leash, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. The man, scruffy-bearded and wide-eyed, fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he hit record. "This is messed up," he muttered under his breath, glancing at his girlfriend whose lips were pressed into a tight, angry line. "They're arresting him for nothing." The tiny red light on his screen blinked steadily, capturing every second of the ordeal. For Elijah, that flickering dot was a lifeline, a fragile spark of hope piercing through the suffocating weight of his reality. Maybe, just maybe, this video would tell his story when he couldn't. Maybe it would show the world the truth of this moment, a man unjustly targeted, his freedom stripped away for no reason at all. As the officers yanked him to his feet, Elijah forced himself to breathe deeply, to steady the whirlwind of fear and frustration swirling inside him. He knew the stakes. Every word, every move could be twisted against him. His mind raced, calculating his next steps, clinging to the thin thread of composure that kept him from breaking. Around him the crowd swelled, a patchwork of curious onlookers and outraged neighbors spilling onto the pavement. Phones were raised like torches, voices lifting in a chorus of dissent. "This isn't right!" a burly man bellowed from across the street, his fists clenched at his sides, his face flushed with indignation. "He didn't do anything!" But Carter and Nelson were deaf to the protests, their expressions carved from stone, their resolve unyielding as they shoved Elijah toward the waiting squad car. The door slammed shut behind him with a hollow clang, sealing him into the back seat like a prisoner of war. Before the engine roared to life, Elijah twisted his head to peer through the smudged window. The faces outside stared back, some etched with concern, others blazing with anger, a few clouded with confusion. He drew a shaky breath, his chest tight with the weight of what was happening, and raised his voice just enough to pierce the glass. "This isn't over," he declared, the words ringing with a quiet defiance that hung in the air like a promise. The car lurched forward, tires crunching against the asphalt, and the crowd faded into a blur as Elijah was carried away. But those words lingered, a vow to himself and to them all. He would not let this be the end. Inside the vehicle, Elijah's thoughts churned like a tempest. What came next? How would he fight this? How could he ensure justice prevailed when the very system meant to uphold it seemed rigged against him? The consequences of this day, of power abused and truth ignored, gnawed at him, sharpening his resolve. He wasn't just a man in cuffs. He was a symbol now, a living testament to the cost of unchecked authority. The police station loomed ahead, a squat gray fortress stark against the vibrant chaos of the streets. Its cold walls and flickering fluorescent lights greeted him like a slap, the hum of activity buzzing in his ears as officers moved with brisk efficiency through the corridors. Some laughed over coffee, others hunched over paperwork. But beneath the routine lay a tension that prickled the air, a silent acknowledgement that something wasn't right. Flanked by Carter and Nelson, Elijah stepped through the station's heavy doors, his wrists still bound, the metal cuffs biting into his skin. The booking area was a blur of faces, officers glancing up from their desks, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. He wasn't the typical suspect they hauled in, and he could feel their curiosity, their suspicion, prickling against him. Dressed in a crisp blazer and slacks, his posture steady despite the circumstances, Elijah carried an air of quiet strength that set him apart. "Step forward," Carter snapped, his voice a low growl as he steered Elijah toward a desk where a weary officer sat, bathed in the blue glow of a computer screen. The officer barely looked up, his fingers hovering over the keyboard with the detachment of someone who'd seen it all. "Name?" he asked, his tone flat. "Elijah Brooks," Carter answered before Elijah could open his mouth, the words clipped and final. The officer typed, his eyes flicking to the screen, a faint frown creasing his brow as he scanned the results. He said nothing, just gestured toward the fingerprinting station with a tired wave. "Let's get this over with," Carter muttered, nudging Elijah forward with a rough shove. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't resist. He knew the game. Any sign of defiance could spiral this nightmare further out of control. As the ink stained his fingertips, his mind spun with disbelief. How had it come to this? He'd done nothing wrong, yet here he was, branded a criminal in a system that thrived on its own distortions of justice. When the process was complete, Carter and Nelson marched him to a holding cell tucked at the back of the station. The space was suffocatingly small, its bare walls closing in around a narrow bench and a rusted metal toilet. The air reeked of bleach and despair, a sour undertone clinging to every breath. They uncuffed him with a clatter, shoving him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Nelson sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You might be here a while." Elijah settled onto the bench, the cold seeping through his clothes, and met Nelson's taunt with silence. He wouldn't rise to the bait, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. As the officers walked away, their footsteps echoing down the hall, they shared a glance, a wordless pact that their work was done. Another troublemaker off the streets, another box checked. But for Carter, a shadow of doubt flickered. Elijah's composure, his unshakable calm. It didn't add up. "Think he's a lawyer or something?" Nelson scoffed as they neared the front desk, his tone dismissive. "Probably just another punk in a fancy suit." Carter grunted in response, but his thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in unease. Something about Elijah gnawed at him, a puzzle he couldn't solve. He shook it off, telling himself it didn't matter. They'd followed orders, and that was enough. Yet the lesson lingered, unspoken but heavy. Power wielded without care could unravel even the strongest convictions. Then a voice cut through the haze. "Hey, Carter," called Officer Stevens, a rookie with bright eyes and a nervous edge. He'd been watching from the sidelines, his youthful eagerness tempered by a sharp mind. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Carter turned, frowning. "What is it?" Stevens hesitated, glancing around before stepping closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That guy you brought in, Elijah Brooks, I think I know who he is." Carter's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in, his words urgent. I saw him in a news article a few weeks back. He's not just a lawyer, he's a civil rights attorney. A big one. High-profile cases, the kind that make headlines. Carter's stomach twisted, but he masked it with a scowl. You sure? Stevens nodded, pulling up a web page on his phone, Elijah's face staring back from the screen. Positive. If we don't handle this right, it's not just an investigation we'll be facing, it's a reckoning. The weight of those words crashed over Carter like a wave, doubt swelling into dread. Justice, he realized, wasn't a straight line. It was a mirror, reflecting the consequences of every choice. And as he waved Stevens off, turning away to bury the unease, one truth burned clear. This arrest wasn't just a mistake. It was a spark that could ignite a firestorm. Stevens stood rooted to the spot, a gnawing unease twisting in his gut as he watched Carter stride away with that familiar swagger. Too confident, too casual for the mess brewing beneath the surface. The air in the station felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension, and Stevens couldn't ignore the prickle of doubt creeping up his spine. His hand trembled slightly as he fished his phone from his pocket, the cool metal grounding him for a fleeting moment. He scrolled through his contacts with purpose, his thumb hovering over the name he needed. Captain. The word stared back at him, a lifeline in the chaos. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, he pressed the call button, his heart thudding against his ribcage. He silently pleaded with himself that this wasn't a mistake, that he wasn't about to set off a chain reaction he couldn't undo. The phone rang once, twice, each tone stretching into eternity before a gruff voice crackled through the speaker. Yeah, Captain. It's Stevens, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray him. We've got a situation down here at the station, something you need to hear about. His words hung in the air, fragile and loaded, as he glanced over his shoulder to ensure no one was listening. Meanwhile, in the dim, sterile confines of the holding cell, Elijah Brooks sat motionless on the hard bench, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. The flickering fluorescent light overhead cast jagged shadows across the concrete floor, but Elijah's mind was far from the bleak surroundings. His thoughts churned, sharp and focused, piecing together the fragments of this strange, unjust ordeal. This wasn't about him, not really. He could feel it in his bones, a certainty that pulsed beneath his calm exterior. Someone had singled him out, painted a target on his back, though the why remained a maddening mystery. Still, he refused to let panic seep in. Fear was a thief, and he'd fought too many battles, seen too much, to let it rob him of his resolve now. He'd endured worse than this cold cell and the weight of false accusations. He'd claw his way through this, too. Time crawled by, each minute dragging like an eternity, until the heavy clang of the holding area door shattered the silence. Elijah's head tilted slightly, his senses sharpening as a woman stepped into the room. She carried herself with an unmistakable presence, late 30s, sharp-eyed, her posture radiating authority that seemed to command the very air around her. Lieutenant Kate Thompson was her name, though Elijah didn't know it yet. She was a recent transfer, a newcomer still finding her footing among the station's tight-knit crew. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her crisp uniform spoke of discipline, but it was her gaze, piercing, unrelenting, that marked her as someone formidable. In just a few weeks, she'd already earned a reputation. A no-nonsense officer who didn't bend, didn't break, and certainly didn't tolerate fools. Thompson's eyes swept the room like a hawk, taking in every detail. The officers shuffling papers, the low hum of conversation, the faint tang of stale coffee lingering in the air. Her attention snagged on Carter and Nelson, huddled at the front desk, their heads bent together in hushed tones. Something about the way they stood, shoulders tense, eyes darting, set her instincts ablaze. She'd honed that sixth sense over years of navigating precinct politics and sniffing out lies. Right now, it was screaming that something was rotten. "Carter Nelson!" she called, her voice cutting through the murmur of the station like a blade. She strode toward them, her boots clicking sharply against the tiled floor. "What's going on here?" Carter's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it with a lazy grin. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day." Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Really? Because words reached me that you brought someone in this morning, a man named Elijah Brooks." Carter stiffened, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough for Thompson to catch. He recovered quickly, his voice smooth as he replied, "Yes, ma'am, we did." "And the charge?" she pressed, her tone deceptively calm, though her gaze bore into him like a drill. "Resisting arrest," Carter said, his words steady, practiced. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he wouldn't cooperate." Thompson arched a brow, skepticism etched into every line of her face. "Did he now?" Carter nodded, unflinching. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't reply immediately, letting the silence stretch taut between them. Her eyes roamed his face, searching for the telltale twitch of a lie. She'd seen his type before, officers who treated rules like suggestions, bending them to fit their own agendas, but Thompson wasn't like them. She'd clawed her way up the ranks with integrity as her compass, and she demanded the same from those under her command. Justice wasn't a game to her. It was a vow. "This way, ma'am," Carter said after a beat, gesturing toward the holding cells, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they walked, Thompson's unease grew, a quiet storm brewing in her chest. The hallway was narrow, the walls a dull gray that seemed to close in around her, amplifying the faint echo of their footsteps. When they reached Elijah's cell, she stopped short, her breath catching as she took him in. He sat there, composed and still, his dark eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength that gave her pause. There was no defiance in his posture, no desperation, just a steady, unshakable calm. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Carter. "Yes, ma'am," he confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest." Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she pushed the cell door open with a slow, deliberate creak and stepped inside. The air was cooler here, tinged with the faint metallic scent of the bars. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice even but firm. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Elijah lifted his head, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that was neither hostile nor submissive. "Of course, Lieutenant," he replied, his tone polite, almost warm. "I'm happy to cooperate." She nodded, appreciating the steadiness in his voice. "I've been told you resisted arrest, which is why you're here. I'd like to hear your version of what happened." Elijah's expression didn't waver, his eyes holding hers as he spoke. "Lieutenant, I didn't resist. I followed every instruction Officers Carter and Nelson gave me. I was walking to my car, minding my own business, when they stopped me. I asked why I was being detained. A simple question. Apparently, that was enough to set them off. Next thing I knew, I was in cuffs, accused of resisting, even though I'd done exactly as they asked." Thompson listened intently, her mind racing as she weighed his words. There was a quiet conviction in his voice, a steel beneath the calm that hinted at a man who'd faced injustice before and come out standing. She turned to Carter, who lingered just outside the cell, his face a carefully crafted mask of indifference. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice sharpening like a blade. "Did Mr. Brooks comply with your instructions?" Carter shifted his weight, discomfort flickering in his eyes. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us, and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Her gaze hardened, pinning him in place. "And what exactly was that reason?" He faltered, his confidence cracking. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling?" Thompson echoed, her tone laced with disbelief, her brows shooting up. "That's what you're basing an arrest on?" Carter opened his mouth to argue, but the sudden groan of the holding area door swinging open cut him off. All heads turned as Stevens burst in, his chest heaving slightly, sweat beading on his forehead. He froze mid-step, his wide eyes darting between Elijah, Carter, and Thompson, realizing he'd stumbled into a powder keg ready to blow. "Lieutenant?" Stevens stammered, catching his breath. "I need to speak with you." Thompson shot Carter one last searing look before stepping out of the cell, the door clanging shut behind her. "What is it, Stevens?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hushed, frantic whisper. "Ma'am, I've been digging." Elijah Brooks isn't just any lawyer. He's a big-time civil rights attorney. High-profile cases, the kind that make waves. Headlines, lawsuits, the works. Thompson's stomach plummeted, a cold dread washing over her. She'd suspected there was more to this, but the reality hit like a freight train. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her voice tight. "Positive," Stevens replied, thrusting his phone into her hands. A web page glowed on the screen, Elijah's stern face staring back at her alongside a list of his accomplishments. She scanned it quickly, her pulse quickening with every word. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a titan, a man who'd toppled corrupt police departments, dismantled corporate giants, and challenged government overreach. This wasn't a minor scuffle. It was a potential catastrophe that could unravel the entire station. She whirled around, her eyes locking onto Carter and Nelson, who stood by the cell, their unease now palpable. "Carter, Nelson!" she barked, striding toward them with fire in her steps. "We need to talk. Now!" The two officers exchanged a wary glance before trailing her out of the holding area, their boots dragging slightly as if they could sense the storm about to break. Once they reached a secluded corner of the station, a cramped office cluttered with files and the faint hum of a dying fluorescent bulb, Thompson spun on them, her expression fierce. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" she demanded, her voice a low, furious growl. "Elijah Brooks isn't some nobody off the street. He's a civil rights legend, and you've just handed him a loaded gun to aim at us." Carter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence damning. Nelson shifted nervously, his eyes darting to the floor. Thompson's mind raced, piecing together the implications. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a lesson in justice, a stark reminder of what happens when power is wielded carelessly. Every move they made now would be scrutinized, every misstep a crack in the fragile facade of authority. And as the weight of it settled over her, she knew one thing for certain. The consequences of this day would echo far beyond these walls, a reckoning for those who thought the rules didn't apply to them. The air in the police station felt thick with tension, a suffocating weight that clung to every breath. Carter's face drained of color, his usual swagger crumbling like a house of cards under the piercing gaze of Lieutenant Thompson. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, betraying the bravado he'd worn so confidently just hours ago when he'd hauled Elijah Brooks into the precinct. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly, "we didn't know who he was. He didn't say a word about being a lawyer. None of us had a clue." His words hung in the air, feeble and unconvincing, as if he could somehow rewind the clock and undo the reckless decision that had landed them all in this mess. Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin, unforgiving line. She wasn't in the mood for excuses. Carter's ignorance only fueled her frustration. "That's irrelevant," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "You should have checked, Carter. You should have done your job properly before dragging someone in here without a shred of evidence. Now we're staring down the barrel of a disaster, and it's on us to clean it up. Fast." Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and urgency as she paced the cramped office, her boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Outside, the faint hum of voices began to swell, seeping through the station's walls like a rising tide. Thompson froze mid-step, her head jerking toward the window as her stomach twisted into knots. The noise wasn't just chatter. It was a chorus of outrage, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and peered through the blinds. Her heart sank as she took in the scene unfolding beyond the glass. A crowd, now numbering dozens, spilling onto the street in front of the station. Their faces were a mix of fury and determination, illuminated by the flickering glow of streetlights. Signs bobbed above their heads, hastily scrawled with demands for justice and Elijah's release. Their chants rang out in unison, a rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the building. "Free Elijah! Justice now!" Thompson cursed under her breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "Perfect," she muttered, sarcasm dripping from her words. "Exactly what we needed to make this day even better." Stevens, a wiry officer with a perpetually worried expression, lingered near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd been hovering on the edges of the conversation, his brow furrowed as he listened to the chaos brewing outside. Now, he stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Lieutenant, this isn't just a few upset folks anymore. The community's already on edge about police issues, and this has lit a match. We've got activists out there, local pastors, even a couple of news vans pulling up. If we don't act soon, this could blow up into something we can't control." His dark eyes met hers, wide with concern, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind. Stevens wasn't one for exaggeration. He'd been around long enough to know how quickly a spark could turn into a wildfire. Thompson nodded grimly, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She'd witnessed this kind of thing before in her years on the force. A minor incident mishandled, a single misstep ignored, and suddenly, the whole city was up in arms. But this wasn't just another routine flare-up. This time, they'd crossed a line by detaining Elijah Brooks, a rights attorney with a fearsome reputation for dismantling cases of police misconduct. If he decided to turn his legal prowess against them, it wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist, it'd be a full-blown reckoning. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not out of fear for herself, but for the fragile trust she'd been working to build in her short time at this station. She'd only been in charge for a few weeks, and already the ground beneath her felt like it was crumbling. "We've got to get ahead of this," she said at last, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She turned to Carter and Nelson, the two officers who'd sparked this nightmare with their sloppy arrest. "Carter, Nelson, I want a detailed report on every single thing you did during that arrest. Every step, every word, every assumption you made. I don't care if it takes you all night. You're not leaving until it's done." Her gaze shifted to Stevens, softening slightly as she addressed him. "Stevens, you're with me. We need to figure out how to talk to the press before they spin this into something we can't come back from. We've got to control the story, or they'll bury us alive." The officers scattered like leaves in the wind, each retreating to their tasks with a mix of dread and determination. As they dispersed, Thompson stood alone for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. She rubbed her temples, trying to stave off the headache creeping in. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't just about calming a crowd or dodging a lawsuit. This was about justice, about the consequences of power wielded carelessly. Carter and Nelson had acted without thinking, and now the entire department was teetering on the edge of a precipice. She couldn't let it fall, not on her watch. Her career, her integrity, and the reputation of the force she'd sworn to uphold were all at stake. Meanwhile, deep within the station's holding area, Elijah Brooks sat on a cold metal bench, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The muffled roar of the crowd outside filtered through the concrete walls, a distant but growing lifeline that stirred something in his chest. He tilted his head, straining to catch the words. His name, chanted over and over, mingled with cries for justice. His sharp mind raced, piecing together the scene beyond his cell. He pictured his sister out there, her voice hoarse from shouting, her eyes blazing with the fierce loyalty she'd always shown him. He imagined the community leaders he'd worked with for years, men and women who'd marched beside him in countless battles for fairness, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold night air. A flicker of hope ignited within him, warm and fragile, but he quickly tamped it down. He'd been in this game too long to let optimism cloud his judgment. The police still held the reins, and he'd seen them twist the truth into knots before. They could still turn this against him if he wasn't careful. Back at the station's entrance, the atmosphere crackled with unrest. The crowd had ballooned to over 100 strong, a sea of faces stretching across the street. Banners waved high, their bold letters spelling out, "Justice for Elijah," in stark black and red. Reporters swarmed the edges, their cameras flashing like lightning, capturing every shout, every gesture. The station itself loomed behind them, its brick facade transformed into a lightning rod for the community's simmering anger. Inside, Thompson stood at the front window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as she watched the scene unfold. Her breath fogged the glass and she wiped it away with an impatient swipe. She felt trapped, balanced on a razor's edge where one wrong move could ignite an explosion. Or worse, let the situation spiral beyond her grasp entirely. Stevens appeared at her side, his face pale and drawn. "Lieutenant, we can't keep him in there," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the chants outside. "It's the only way to bring this down a notch." Thompson's shoulders stiffened, but she knew he was right. Releasing Elijah was their best shot at avoiding a catastrophe. She let out a slow, controlled breath, her mind racing for a way to spin it. "We'll call it a misunderstanding," she said finally, her tone clipped. "We reviewed the evidence, found no grounds for the arrest, and let him go. We'll play it up. Say we're serious about justice, about doing the right thing. It's not airtight, but it might just work." Stevens nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. The media wouldn't buy it easily, and neither would the crowd. But it was a lifeline. They had to cling to it. With her decision made, Thompson strode back through the station, her steps purposeful, despite the exhaustion tugging at her limbs. She passed Carter and Nelson, hunched over their desks, their fingers flying across keyboards as they scrambled to justify their actions. She paused, her shadow falling over them like a storm cloud. "When this is over," she said, her voice icy and deliberate, "we're going to sit down and dissect every mistake you made today. And believe me, it's not going to be a pleasant chat." Carter's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. He knew he'd dug himself a hole too deep to climb out of alone, and all he could do now was pray Thompson could pull them all back from the brink. When she reached Elijah's cell, Thompson unlocked the door herself, the key cold against her palm. She stepped inside, her posture rigid but her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice steady, "I've gone over everything, and it's clear there was a mix-up. You're free to leave." Elijah rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of guarded skepticism. "A mix-up, Lieutenant?" he said, his tone laced with quiet disbelief. "Is that what we're settling on?" His eyes locked onto hers, probing, searching for the crack in her armor. Thompson didn't flinch, meeting his stare head-on. "Yes," she replied firmly, "and I'm sorry it came to this. It shouldn't have happened." Her apology was sincere, but she knew it wouldn't erase the sting of the day's events. Elijah studied her for a long moment, his mind weighing her words against the years of experience that had taught him to trust actions over promises. Finally, he gave a slight nod, a gesture that carried more weight than words. "I'll take the apology, Lieutenant," he said softly, "but don't think this ends here." His warning hung between them, heavy with the promise of consequences yet to come. Thompson didn't doubt him for a second. Elijah Brooks wasn't the type to let injustice slide, and she braced herself for the fight she knew was looming on the horizon. She escorted him out of the holding area, past officers who averted their eyes as he passed, their shame palpable in the air. At the station's front door, she stopped, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "I'll do what I can to make this right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded once more, but he didn't respond. He stepped outside, and the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of triumph. Camera flashes lit up the night, reporters shouting questions that went unanswered as Elijah moved toward the familiar faces of his family and friends. His sister threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her cheeks, while an older man, perhaps a pastor or a mentor, clapped him on the shoulder with a proud, weary smile. Thompson lingered in the doorway, her face unreadable as she watched the reunion unfold. The immediate danger had passed. The crowd was thinning, the reporters packing up their gear, but she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Elijah's release had doused the flames for now, but the embers of resentment still glowed hot beneath the surface. He'd be back, armed with his legal expertise and the righteous fury of a man wronged, and the fallout would ripple through the station, the department, and maybe even the city itself. She turned away, retreating into the building, already steeling herself for the battles ahead. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about righting a single wrong. It was about facing the consequences of power misused, a lesson Carter and Nelson would learn the hard way. As Elijah walked away, his steps steady despite the weight of the day, he felt the spark of a new fight igniting within him. He'd been unjustly detained, humiliated, but he also knew how to wield the law like a sword. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war for accountability, a chance to expose the cracks in a system that too often hid behind its badge. The crowd's cheers faded into the distance, but their voices lingered in his mind, a reminder of the strength he carried forward. The station receded behind him, a looming silhouette against the night sky, and Elijah knew one thing for certain. This story was far from over. The air inside the police station felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension that clung to every corner like damp fog on a winter morning. It had been that way ever since Elijah Brooks strode out through the front doors, his head held high, his steps deliberate, as though he'd already won a battle no one else knew was being fought. Lieutenant Kate Thompson sat alone in her office, the faint hum of the station's bustle seeping through the walls. She leaned over her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of the preliminary reports from Officers Carter and Nelson, but her mind was elsewhere. Her hazel eyes, sharp and weary from years of sleepless nights, kept darting to the empty doorway, as if expecting Elijah to walk back in. Something about him gnawed at her, a quiet certainty in his demeanor, a calmness that felt almost defiant. It wasn't the reaction of a man who'd just been hauled in cuffs. It was the composure of someone who knew more than he let on. And that unsettled her deeply. Kate wasn't the type to dismiss a hunch. She'd spent 2 decades on the force, climbing the ranks through grit and instinct, learning to trust the little voice in her gut when the pieces of a puzzle didn't fit. Right now, that voice was screaming. Outside her office, the station carried on with a muted energy, the kind that settles in after a storm. Officers shuffled papers, typed reports, and avoided each other's gazes, their movements stiff and cautious. The crowd that had gathered earlier, shouting, waving signs, demanding answers, had mostly trickled away, leaving behind a lingering unease that pulsed through the town like a heartbeat. Everyone knew this wasn't over. Whatever had happened with Elijah Brooks, it was a spark that could ignite something much bigger, and Kate felt the weight of that possibility pressing down on her chest. She leaned back in her creaky chair, the springs groaning under her weight, and tilted her head to stare at the cracked plaster ceiling. The silence in her small, cluttered office stood in sharp contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. Who was Elijah Brooks, really? Why had his arrest, a routine stop gone wrong, sent ripples through the station and beyond? She couldn't let it go. Not for her own peace of mind, and certainly not for the department she'd sworn to protect. Justice, she'd always believed, wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about seeking the truth, no matter how ugly or inconvenient. And if power had been abused here, if her officers had crossed a line, the consequences could tear everything apart. She reached for her laptop, her fingers tapping the keys with a restless urgency, determined to uncover the man behind the arrest. What she found stopped her cold. The screen glowed with articles, news clips, and grainy video interviews, each one peeling back a layer of Elijah Brooks she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a lawyer, as the initial report had suggested. He was a civil rights attorney, a titan in the field, who'd spent years taking on giants, corrupt corporations, crooked politicians, and, most notably, police departments riddled with rot. His name was tied to cases that had toppled careers and rewritten laws, victories that left a trail of changed lives in their wake. Kate's pulse quickened as she scrolled through the details of his latest triumph, a lawsuit against a police force in a neighboring city. The case had exposed a web of bribery, brutality, and cover-ups, leading to firings, indictments, and a public reckoning that still echoed in the headlines. Elijah had walked away a hero to some, a target to others, and now he'd landed in her jurisdiction. Her eyes narrowed as she dug deeper, the pieces clicking into place with a chilling clarity. There it was, buried in a dense report from a legal blog. Elijah Brooks had been part of a federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement. The probe had already forced oversight onto several departments, and whispers suggested more were under the microscope, including, quite possibly, hers. Kate's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, dialing a number she hadn't used in months. A contact in the FBI, a gruff but reliable agent named Samuels who owed her a favor. "I need you to tell me what you know about Elijah Brooks," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The call was short, clipped, but when she hung up, her worst fears were confirmed. Elijah wasn't just a lawyer passing through. He was undercover, gathering evidence for a federal case that could dismantle entire chains of command, hers included. Kate slumped back in her chair, her mind racing like a runaway train. This wasn't a random arrest gone wrong. Elijah had been targeted, and Officers Carter and Nelson had stumbled into a trap they couldn't possibly have seen coming. If this broke open, the scandal would be catastrophic. A wildfire that would consume the department, the town, and every shred of trust they'd built with the community. She couldn't let that happen. Not on her watch. She spent the next hour hunched over her desk, piecing together every scrap of information she could find. Elijah's past cases, his allies in Washington, the scope of the federal investigation. Each revelation tightened the knot in her stomach. This was bigger than she'd ever imagined, a reckoning that could expose not just mistakes, but a deeper corruption she hadn't wanted to believe existed. Finally, she stood, smoothing her uniform with shaking hands. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. She had to confront Carter and Nelson, had to know what they'd done, why they'd done it, and how much damage they'd unleashed. As she strode into the bullpen, her boots thudding against the worn linoleum, the air seemed to shift. Heads turned, then quickly looked away. She spotted the two officers at their desks, hunched over their reports, their faces etched with exhaustion and something else, guilt maybe, or fear. "Carter, Nelson!" she barked, her voice cutting through the low hum of the room. "We need to talk, now!" They glanced at each other, a silent exchange of unease, before rising to follow her. She led them to a stark conference room down the hall, its bare walls and scratched table a fitting stage for the confrontation ahead. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in with the truth she was about to unleash. Carter shifted in his chair, his broad shoulders tense beneath his uniform. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice guarded. "Is there something you need?" Nelson, younger and wirier, fidgeted with a pen, his dark eyes darting to the floor. Kate crossed her arms, fixing them with a stare that could have cracked stone. "I know who Elijah Brooks is," she said, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. Carter's eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking through his usual calm. Nelson stiffened, his knuckles whitening around the pen. Neither spoke, but she could see it. The dawning realization that they'd stepped into something far beyond their control. "He's a civil rights attorney," she continued, her tone low and edged with fury. "A federal asset. He's been working undercover, collecting evidence on police corruption, evidence that could bury this department. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Carter's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find words. "We didn't know, Lieutenant," he managed, his voice hoarse. "He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just—" Nelson started to chime in, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Just another guy, we thought—" But Kate cut him off, her voice rising like a whip. "Just another what? Another black man you could shove around without a second thought?" Nelson flinched, his gaze dropping to his boots, shame creeping into the lines of his face. Carter opened his mouth, then closed it, the fight draining out of him as the weight of her words sank in. "You've put us all at risk," Kate said, her voice icy with restrained anger. "Not just the department, but the whole damn city. If this investigation blows up, and it will, we're all going down with it. Everything we've worked for, every ounce of trust we've earned, gone." She paced the room, her boots echoing in the silence, her mind churning with the implications. Justice, she thought bitterly, wasn't supposed to feel this fragile. Power, when wielded carelessly, could shatter lives in an instant, and these two had swung it like a sledgehammer without even knowing what they were hitting. Carter finally spoke, his voice small. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following protocol." Kate whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Protocol? You arrested a man without cause, treated him like a criminal, and now we're tangled in a federal case that could end us all. This isn't about protocol anymore. This is about accountability." Nelson looked like he might be sick, his hands trembling as he set the pen down. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could answer, the door burst open with a force that rattled the walls. Chief Frank Daniels stormed in, his barrel chest heaving, his face flushed a deep crimson. His gray eyes blazed with a fury that made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. "Lieutenant Thompson!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "What the hell is going on here?" Kate straightened, meeting his glare head-on, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. The storm had arrived, and she was ready to face it. Because if justice meant anything, it was standing firm when the consequences came crashing down. The air in the dimly lit conference room crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on, as Chief Frank Daniels fixed his furious gaze on Lieutenant Kate Thompson. His eyes burned with a barely restrained fury, the kind that could melt steel, as he leaned forward over the polished oak table. "Chief, we've got a serious problem," Thompson began, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of dread. "Elijah Brooks is—" "I know exactly who Elijah Brooks is," Daniels cut in, his words sharp and venomous, slicing through the air like a blade. His tone carried years of pent-up frustration, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. "And I know exactly what kind of mess you've dragged us into, Thompson." His lips curled into a sneer as he spat her name, his anger a living thing, pulsing in the space between them. Thompson blinked, caught off guard by the venom in his voice. Surprise flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it, her jaw tightening as she squared her shoulders. "Chief, she started, her voice rising slightly in defense. "Save it!" Daniels snapped, his hand slashing through the air to silence her. His face was a mask of rage, the lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes betraying the weight of the moment. "Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put this department in? We've got a civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and you've just handed him a loaded gun with our name on it. He's got everything he needs to tear us apart, Thompson. This is a disaster, and it's on you." Her jaw clenched harder, a muscle twitching in her cheek as she fought to keep her composure. The accusation stung, a sharp jab to her pride, but she wasn't about to let it break her. "With all due respect, Chief," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "it's not just on me. Officers Carter and Nelson made the arrest, without cause, without evidence, and now we're all drowning in the fallout." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth, as she met his gaze unflinchingly. Daniel's eyes flicked to the two officers standing stiffly in the corner, their faces pale and drawn. Carter shifted his weight, his boots scuffing faintly against the linoleum floor, while Nelson stared straight ahead, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The chief's expression darkened, a storm cloud rolling over his features. "We'll deal with them later," he growled, his voice a low rumble of barely contained wrath. "Right now, we need to focus on damage control." Thompson nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to steady her racing heart. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest, a suffocating pressure that made every breath a struggle. "I've already started digging into it," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "There's a federal investigation. Systemic racism in law enforcement tied to recent oversight of local police. Elijah Brooks has been gathering evidence for months. If we don't handle this with precision, Chief, it could bury us." Daniels's anger simmered, a bubbling cauldron just beneath his steely exterior. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to lash out, but he held it in check, his years of command forcing a thin veneer of control over his rage. "What's our next move?" he demanded, his voice tight with urgency. Before Thompson could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the room, reverberating off the sterile white walls. The door creaked open, and a young officer poked his head in, his face a mask of nervous energy. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, as if he'd been pacing the halls, and his wide eyes darted between the chief and the lieutenant. "Chief, Lieutenant," he stammered, his voice trembling slightly. "There's someone here to see you. It's urgent." Daniels' brow furrowed, his irritation flaring anew. "Who is it?" he barked, his patience fraying like a worn rope. The officer swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "A federal agent. His name's Williams." Silence crashed over the room like a tidal wave, heavy and oppressive. Thompson's breath caught in her chest as she exchanged a tense glance with Daniels. This was it. The moment they'd feared, the shadow that had loomed over them since the arrest. Daniels' jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his weathered skin. "Send him in," he ordered, his voice a low, strained growl. The young officer nodded quickly and scurried off, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall. A moment later, the door swung open again, and Agent Mark Williams stepped inside. He was a towering figure, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in off the horizon. His dark suit hugged his broad frame, impeccably tailored, and the badge clipped to his belt gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His face was stern, etched with lines of authority and resolve, and his piercing gaze swept the room, taking in every detail with surgical precision. "Chief Daniels, Lieutenant Thompson," he greeted them, his tone clipped and formal, carrying an edge of unspoken judgment. Daniels straightened, squaring his shoulders as if bracing for a fight. "Agent Williams," he said, forcing a semblance of control into his voice, "I'm sure we can explain." Williams raised a hand, cutting him off with a single deliberate gesture. "There's no need for explanations, Chief," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, like the steady drip of water wearing down stone. "I'm well aware of what's happened here, and let me be perfectly clear, this is a very serious matter." Thompson's pulse quickened, a frantic drumbeat in her ears as she studied the agent. There was no mistaking the gravity in his tone, the quiet menace that underscored every word. Whatever was coming, it was big, bigger than she'd feared. "Elijah Brooks is a key asset in a federal investigation," Williams continued, his words measured and precise. "An investigation that's been in motion for months. His arrest was a mistake, a reckless, costly mistake. And if it's not handled with the utmost care, the consequences will ripple far beyond this room." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The weight of Williams's words settled over him like a shroud, and for the first time, a flicker of unease broke through his iron facade. "We understand, Agent Williams," he said stiffly, his voice betraying the strain of the moment. "We're prepared to cooperate fully." "Good," Williams replied, his tone sharp and clipped, a blade slicing through the tension. "Because right now, your cooperation is the only thing standing between this department and a full-blown crisis." His gaze hardened as he swept it across the room, landing briefly on Carter and Nelson, who shrank under the scrutiny. "You will provide Brooks with a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to these orders will be met with swift, decisive action." Daniels's face flushed a deep crimson, his pride warring with the reality of the situation, but he nodded stiffly. "Understood," he muttered through gritted teeth. Williams turned to Thompson, his expression unreadable, a blank slate masking whatever thoughts churned beneath. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice firm, "I expect you to oversee this personally. Make sure there are no further missteps." Thompson nodded, her mouth dry as sandpaper. "I'll take care of it," she managed, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. With a curt nod, Williams turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with military precision. But just before he reached the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous murmur. "One more thing," he said, each word laced with warning. "Consider this your only heads up. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct in this department will be dealt with ruthlessly." Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the silence. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, the weight of the encounter crashing down on her like a collapsing wall. Her chest tightened, her breaths shallow and ragged as the full scope of their predicament sank in. This wasn't just about Elijah Brooks anymore. This was about the soul of the department, the fragile trust of the city, and the consequences of years of unchecked power. She knew the path ahead would be a minefield, every step fraught with peril, but there was no turning back now. The station buzzed with a restless, electric energy as the day dragged on, the events of the morning rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water. Word of Brooks's wrongful arrest had spread through the city like wildfire, fanning flames of outrage that licked at the edges of the community. Outside, the streets swelled with protesters, activists waving signs, community leaders shouting through megaphones, and ordinary citizens whose anger had finally boiled over. Their voices rose in a cacophony of demands for justice, a chorus that reverberated through the station's brick walls. Inside, Daniels sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn tight against the chaos beyond. His desk was cluttered with papers, reports, memos, a half-empty coffee mug, but his eyes were fixed on the phone, its black surface gleaming dully in the dim light. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the receiver, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a physical force. He dialed the public relations team, his fingers fumbling over the keys, and when the line clicked to life, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "I need you to draft a public apology," he said, each word heavy with resignation. "We're addressing the media this afternoon, outside the station. Make it good." "Understood, Chief," came the brisk reply. "We'll have something ready right away." Daniels hung up and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning, graying hair. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as the reality of the situation bore down on him. For years, he'd turned a blind eye to officers like Carter and Nelson, men who bent the rules, crossed lines, and justified it all in the name of keeping order. He'd told himself it was necessary, that the world wasn't black and white, that compromises were part of the job. But now those compromises were a noose tightening around his neck, and the bitter taste of regret lingered on his tongue. A knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Thompson stood in the doorway, her posture rigid, her face a mask of determination tinged with exhaustion. "Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the stifling air, "Elijah Brooks is outside with the crowd." Daniels nodded, forcing himself to his feet. His knees ached, a dull reminder of the years he'd spent in this chair, in this life. "Good," he said, his tone gruff but resolute. "I'm going out there to make the apology." Thompson hesitated, her hand lingering on the doorframe. Then she stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. "Chief," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something unsaid, "there's something else I need to tell you." The air in the cramped office felt heavy as Chief Daniels stood by the window, staring out at the restless world beyond the glass. He turned slightly, catching the faint arch of Lieutenant Thompson's eyebrow as she hesitated. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, sensing the storm brewing in her silence. Thompson drew in a long, steadying breath, her chest rising as if she were bracing herself for the plunge. "I've uncovered something rotten, Daniels," she said, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "Evidence, hard, undeniable evidence, of corruption festering in this department, bribery staining the books, cover-ups burying the truth, racial profiling etched into the daily grind. It's not just Carter and Nelson pulling strings in the shadows. This is systemic. It's been eating away at us for years, swept under the rug like dust nobody wants to touch." A cold shiver snaked down Daniel's spine, his fingers tightening against the window frame as her words sank in. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with the weight of her revelation. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked, his voice a mix of dread and disbelief, though deep down he already knew the answer. Thompson's nod was firm, her jaw set with a quiet fire. "I've been digging, piecing it together with Elijah's help. The federal oversight team's on board now, too. We've got files, recordings, testimonies, enough to start dismantling this mess. But it's not going to be quick or easy. We're talking about uprooting decades of filth, and it's going to get ugly before it gets better." Daniels exhaled, a slow, weary sound that seemed to drag the strength from his broad shoulders. They sagged under the invisible burden of her words, the reality of what lay ahead settling like a lead weight in his gut. "Then we do what's right," he said, his tone resolute despite the tremor of exhaustion beneath it. "We face the consequences of what's been done. Our actions, our silence, no more hiding." Thompson gave a small, approving nod, her lips curving just enough to show she believed in him. "I've got your back out there, Chief. The community needs to see we're not just blowing smoke this time. They need to feel the change." He didn't respond with words. His eyes, dark and stormy, carried the weight of his thoughts. A silent vow that this wasn't about saving his own skin anymore. This was about survival, not just for him, but for the entire department teetering on the edge of collapse. If they didn't act now, the cracks would widen and the whole structure would come crashing down. Together, they left the dim confines of the office, their footsteps echoing down the tiled hallway as they approached the station's front doors. The muffled roar of the crowd outside seeped through the walls, angry voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a crumbling shore, demanding justice, hunting for someone to hold accountable. Daniel's stomach twisted into a tight knot, a flicker of anxiety sparking in his chest, but he forced his face into a mask of calm. He pushed the doors open and stepped into the blinding sunlight, the heat of the day hitting him like a physical blow. The crowd fell into a hushed, expectant silence as he emerged, a sea of faces staring up at him, some furious, some weary, all searching for answers. Cameras snapped like gunfire, microphones thrust forward like spears, and reporters shouted questions that blended into a chaotic hum. Daniels ignored the noise, his focus narrowing to the rickety podium set up for the press conference. Among the throng, Elijah Brooks stood tall, his expression a mystery carved in stone, his presence radiating a quiet power that drew every eye. Daniels felt the weight of that gaze as he adjusted the microphone, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The eyes of the crowd bore into him, judging, waiting, measuring his every move. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained, as if each word had to claw its way out of his throat. "I want to start by addressing what happened earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Elijah Brooks was a grave mistake, one that never should have occurred. I take full responsibility for this failure, and I offer my deepest, most sincere apologies to Mr. Brooks and to every single member of this community." Mete. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and simmering anger threading through the air. Daniels could feel it, the pressure building, the decades of broken trust pressing down on him like a mountain. "We know this isn't an isolated incident," he continued, his tone growing heavier, more somber. "It's part of a deeper, uglier problem that's been allowed to fester within our department for far too long. I'm here to tell you that we're not turning a blind eye anymore. We're facing it head-on. Effective immediately, Officers Carter and Nelson are suspended, and an internal investigation is underway. We're launching a full review of our practices, every policy, every procedure, and we'll be working hand in hand with federal oversight to ensure we meet the highest standards of accountability." The crowd was quieter now, listening with rapt attention, but Daniels could see the doubt flickering in their eyes, the exhaustion of hearing promises that never held. "I know words aren't enough," he said, his voice faltering for a moment, raw with the truth of it. "We've got a long road ahead to rebuild the trust we've shattered. But I'm standing here to commit to that work, to real change. We'll partner with community leaders, activists, and organizations to forge a department that serves and protects every single one of you, no matter who you are or where you come from." He paused, searching for the words to seal his promise, but before he could find them, Elijah Brooks stepped forward. "Chief Daniels," Elijah said, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade, raising a hand to halt the chief mid-breath. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't about pretty speeches. This is about action. True justice isn't a press conference or a handshake. It's change you can see, accountability you can feel, commitment that lasts." Daniels nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone, a silent acknowledgement that Elijah's words hit harder than his own ever could. An apology was a start, but it was just the first step on a treacherous path. Elijah turned to the crowd, his broad shoulders squared, his presence commanding their undivided focus. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice rising, carrying over the sea of faces. "But what we need now is more than words on the wind. We need a promise carved in stone, a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold the powerful accountable when they abuse their authority, and we need to build a system that treats every soul with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted, applause thundering through the air, voices lifting in a chorus of agreement. Elijah's words sliced through the anger and frustration that had been simmering for years, striking a chord deep in their bones. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he went on, his tone steady and clear, resonating with unshakable resolve. "This is about all of us. Every person who's been wronged by a system that's supposed to shield them, not break them. It's about making damn sure no one else has to endure what I did. Or worse. Justice isn't a buzzword to toss around. It's a reality we have to fight for, tooth and nail." The cheers swelled louder, a tidal wave of sound crashing over the station steps. Elijah paused, letting the energy of the moment flood through him. He could see it in their eyes. Hope flickering to life, a hunger for something better. It was intoxicating, a call he couldn't ignore. "Change doesn't come easy," he said, his voice softening, more measured now, but no less powerful. "It's not a switch you flip overnight. It takes time, sweat, and every one of us pulling together. But I believe we can do it. I believe we can build a future that's not just for us, but for the kids who'll inherit what we leave behind." The applause roared again, a tidal surge of support that seemed to lift him up. Elijah stepped back from the podium, his message delivered, his heart pounding with the weight of what he'd ignited. He knew this was only the beginning, a spark in a long, grueling battle, but he was ready to lead it. As Elijah waded into the crowd, hands reaching out to clasp his, friends and strangers alike offering words of encouragement, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the station steps. Relief washed over her, cool and fleeting, knowing the immediate crisis had been diffused. But beneath it burned a fierce resolve. She wouldn't let this momentum die. The department faced a steep climb, but with voices like Elijah's ringing out, she dared to hope they could reach the summit. She glanced at Daniels, still lingering by the podium, his face etched with exhaustion and a flicker of determination. "We've got a hell of a lot of work ahead," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the fading echoes of the crowd. He nodded, his gaze locked on the dispersing throng. "Yeah, we do. But we'll get there." As the crowd thinned, Thompson's eyes caught on a figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. He was tall, clad in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the sunlight, his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable authority. His intense gaze tracked Elijah's every move, a predator sizing up its prey, or perhaps an ally measuring a leader. Who he was, Thompson couldn't say, but the weight of his presence sent a shiver through her, a whisper of something larger looming on the horizon. The air was thick with the hum of curiosity as Lieutenant Thompson wove her way through the bustling crowd at the station. Her boots clicked sharply against the tiled floor, each step echoing her growing intrigue. A man stood apart from the chaos, his presence commanding yet enigmatic, and she felt an instinctive pull to approach him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a subtle wariness she couldn't shake. The man turned to face her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. His eyes were like shards of glass, sharp, cold, and unrelenting. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Brooks," he replied, his tone low and deliberate, each word measured as if carrying a hidden weight. "I have a message for him." Thompson's brow furrowed as she studied him more closely, her mind racing to place the unease that gnawed at her. There was something about him, his rigid posture, the faint smirk tugging at his lips, that sent a shiver down her spine. "Who are you?" she pressed, her tone sharpening with suspicion. The man's smile widened just a fraction, but it was a hollow gesture, devoid of any real warmth. "Just someone with a deep, personal stake in seeing justice served," he said cryptically, his words lingering in the air like a storm cloud on the horizon. Before she could probe further, he turned on his heel and melted into the throng of people, his dark coat swallowed by the sea of bodies moving toward Elijah Brooks. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, her stomach twisting with a foreboding she couldn't name. The sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows across the station steps like skeletal fingers reaching for answers. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this mysterious stranger would cross their paths again, and that the day's events were merely the opening notes of a much larger symphony, one where justice and consequence would play a relentless tune. Across the city, in a modest community center bathed in the soft glow of flickering fluorescent lights, Elijah Brooks sat at the head of a weathered wooden table. Around him gathered a vibrant mosaic of voices, community leaders with furrowed brows, activists with fire in their eyes, legal experts scribbling notes, and everyday citizens clutching coffee cups, their faces etched with both exhaustion and resolve. The room buzzed with the energy of purpose as they hashed out the framework of the Community Justice Initiative. Sophia Chang, a schoolteacher with a quiet strength and a cascade of dark hair framing her thoughtful face, leaned forward, her voice rising with conviction. "If we want change that lasts, real, enduring change, we have to start with the kids. Education is the root of everything." Her hands gestured passionately, as if she could mold the future with her fingertips. Dr. Marcus Flynn, a sociology professor with a salt and pepper beard and a voice that carried the weight of years spent studying broken systems, nodded but countered with urgency. "Absolutely, Sophia, but we can't turn a blind eye to the people suffering right now. Families are being torn apart, lives ruined by an unjust system. We need action on all fronts. Immediate relief and long-term reform." Elijah listened intently, his pen scratching across a worn notebook as he absorbed every word. His dark eyes flickered with admiration for the room's collective spirit. This was what he'd dreamed of, a coalition of hearts and minds, each person bringing their own scars and strengths to the table. Sophia's passion for the next generation stirred something hopeful in him, while Marcus's insistence on addressing the present reminded him of the stakes. As the meeting stretched into the night, ideas crystallized into plans: a legal aid clinic to lift the voiceless, a community oversight board to shadow the police, and educational programs to plant seeds of equity in young minds. When they finally adjourned, the air crackled with a shared sense of momentum. They were weary, yes, but invigorated. Like runners at the starting line of a marathon, they were determined to finish together. Weeks bled into months, and the city began to shift beneath their efforts. At the police station, Thompson stood as a sentinel of change, her crisp uniform a symbol of her unwavering commitment. Alongside the newly minted oversight board, a group of citizens with stern faces and dog-eared notebooks, the department rolled out training programs. Officers practiced de-escalation techniques in mock scenarios, their voices softening as they learned to see the humanity in every encounter. Cultural sensitivity workshops filled the air with uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Officer Stevens, a burly man with a quick temper but a buried desire to do right, emerged as an unexpected ally. He volunteered to shadow community leaders, his broad shoulders hunched as he listened to their stories, his notepad filling with insights he'd never considered before. Meanwhile, the Community Justice Initiative roared to life. The legal aid clinic, housed in a cramped office with peeling paint and mismatched chairs, became a beacon for the desperate. Lawyers with tired eyes but fierce spirits pored over case files late into the night, representing those who'd been wrongfully detained or battered by misconduct. In schools, pilot programs took root, classrooms buzzing with debates about rights and responsibility, students scribbling essays that echoed with newfound awareness. The city's atmosphere began to hum with something new: engagement. Neighborhood watch groups swapped suspicion for collaboration, working with officers to weave safety nets without the threads of prejudice. Community forums sprang up like wildflowers, their folding chairs filled with citizens and officials trading words, sometimes heated, sometimes healing, under the glow of gymnasium lights. Yet the path was far from smooth. Misconduct still flared, flashes of brutality that tested their resolve. Tension simmered in quiet corners, and mistrust lingered like a stubborn fog. Some resisted with clenched fists and raised voices, unwilling to let go of the old ways. But now, there were mechanisms to catch these stumbles, boards to investigate, voices to demand accountability, and a collective will to press onward. Justice, they learned, was a slow burn, its flames fed by persistence and consequence. 6 months after the spark that ignited it all, Elijah found himself back at the station, not as a name on a report, but as a voice in the room. The invitation to speak to new recruits had come from Thompson herself, her handshake firm and her eyes alight with respect. "Call me Elijah," he'd said, and she'd smiled, a real smile, one that reached her tired eyes. The training room was a sea of young faces, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with skepticism. He felt the weight of their stares, knowing he embodied a challenge to the badge they'd soon wear. "Good morning," he began, his voice a calm river cutting through their uncertainty. "My name is Elijah Brooks, and I'm here to talk about justice. Not just the kind you'll enforce, but the kind that demands you see every person as human, worthy of dignity." He shared his story, the fear, the frustration, the faint hope, and watched as they leaned in, asking questions that cracked open their preconceptions. Afterward, a recruit named Sarah Johnson approached, her youthful face set with determination. "I joined to make a difference," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "But lately, I've wondered if I'm on the wrong side. You reminded me why I'm here." Elijah's heart swelled. "The department needs you, Sarah. Your questions, your heart. Hold on to that." As she walked away, he felt the tide of possibility rising. Later, in his office at the Initiative, surrounded by stacks of files and the faint scent of coffee, he reflected on the journey. Each case they won, each life they touched, was a testament to the cost of power unchecked and the power of justice reclaimed. A knock broke his reverie, and Sophia Chang stood in the doorway, her eyes bright with the same fire that had lit their first meeting. The fight was far from over, but together they were rewriting its ending, one determined step at a time. The room buzzed with an electric energy as Sophia burst through the door, her voice trembling with uncontainable excitement. "Elijah," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I just stepped out of a meeting with the school board. They've given the green light to roll out our curriculum across every high school in the district." Her eyes sparkled with pride, her hands gesturing wildly as if she could barely contain the joy surging through her. Elijah, seated at the cluttered desk strewn with papers and coffee cups, shot to his feet, a grin breaking across his face like the dawn chasing away the night. "That's incredible, Sophia," he exclaimed, his deep voice resonating with a warmth that filled the small office. "All those late nights, all your relentless effort, it's finally bearing fruit." Sophia's smile widened, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of victory. But then a shadow flickered across her features, tempering her elation with something more somber. She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "It's not just me, Elijah," she said, her tone softening yet firm. "This is our triumph. None of this would have happened without you, without everything you endured." Her words hung between them, weighted with unspoken memories of the struggles that had brought them here. Elijah shook his head, his brow furrowing slightly as he waved off the praise. "I might have sparked something," he admitted, his voice low and reflective. "But this is so much bigger than one person. It's all of us. Every voice, every hand, coming together to carve out the change we've been dreaming of." His eyes drifted to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the floor, as if mirroring the hope igniting within him. Together, they dove into the nitty-gritty of the curriculum rollout, their conversation a dance of ideas and logistics. Sophia paced the room, her steps quick and purposeful, sketching out timelines on a whiteboard with a marker that squeaked against the surface. Elijah leaned back in his chair, scribbling notes, his mind racing with the possibilities. Every detail they hashed out, the lesson plans, the teacher training sessions, the student workshops, felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something monumental. For Elijah, this wasn't just paperwork or planning, it was the heartbeat of real transformation. Not the fleeting noise of marches or the echo of impassioned speeches, but tangible, lasting impact. The kind that would ripple through their community for years, molding the minds of kids who'd grow up believing justice wasn't just a lofty ideal, but a promise they could hold on to. Later that night, after the office had emptied and the hum of activity faded, Elijah lingered outside the building. The street stretched before him, hushed and still, bathed in the soft glow of flickering streetlights. The city had settled into its nocturnal rhythm, a quiet symphony of distant car horns and the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. He stood there, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his breath fogging in the crisp March air. 6 months ago, this moment would have been unthinkable. Back then, he'd been a man caught in a storm, wrongfully arrested, his name dragged through the mud, his faith in fairness shattered. Now, as he tilted his head back to gaze at the stars piercing the velvet sky, a quiet peace settled over him, soothing the jagged edges of his soul. The road ahead loomed long and uncertain, riddled with obstacles he couldn't yet see, but he felt a steady resolve thrumming in his chest. They were moving forward, step by painstaking step, building a world where justice wasn't just a hollow word carved into courthouse walls. It was a living, breathing reality for every person who called this place home. As he started the walk back to his apartment, his boots thudded softly against the cracked sidewalk, each step a testament to his renewed determination. Tomorrow would dawn with fresh challenges, new battles to fight, new chances to tip the scales toward equity. And he was ready. Not just willing, but eager, fueled by a fire that had been kindled in the ashes of his own hardship. This wasn't a solo journey. It never had been. It was Sophia's tireless spirit, the school board's reluctant nod, the whispers of support from neighbors who'd once turned away. It was the collective heartbeat of a community daring to demand more. Reflecting on it all, Elijah couldn't help but think of the others who'd stood beside him in the shadows of those darker days. There was Marcus, the wiry, quick-witted shop owner down the street, who'd slipped him coffee and a sympathetic ear when the weight of false accusations threatened to crush him. Marcus had been the first to show up at the precinct that awful night, his voice cutting through the chaos, demanding answers when Elijah had none left to give. Then there was Lena, the soft-spoken librarian with a steel backbone, who'd organized quiet meetings in her basement, rallying folks to speak out when silence felt safer. These weren't just side players in his story, they were the sinew and soul of this movement, each one carrying their own scars from a system that too often bent the rules to favor the powerful. Elijah's mind drifted to that fateful night 6 months prior, when the cold metal of handcuffs had bitten into his wrists. He could still feel the sting of humiliation as officers hauled him from his own doorstep, their shouts drowning out his pleas. The neighbors had peeked through curtains, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment, while the flashing lights of the squad car painted the street in harsh reds and blues. It hadn't been just his arrest. It was a violation of trust, a stark reminder of how quickly power could turn predator. But from that low, a spark had flared. The community's outrage had simmered, then boiled over, spilling into town halls and street corners, their voices rising in a chorus that refused to be ignored. This journey taught a brutal yet beautiful lesson. Justice isn't handed down from on high. It's forged in the crucible of collective will. When those in authority abuse their power, when they wield it to silence rather than serve, the consequences ripple far beyond the individual they target. Elijah's wrongful arrest hadn't just wounded him. It had cracked open a fault line in the community, exposing the rot of unchecked privilege, but it also revealed resilience, the kind that blooms when people lock arms and refuse to let the story end there. The officers who'd cuffed him that night weren't faceless villains. They were products of a system that too often prized compliance over compassion. Their actions demanded accountability, a reckoning that went beyond apologies or slaps on the wrist. It called for a dismantling of the structures that let power run wild. As Elijah turned the key in his apartment door, the familiar creak of the hinges grounding him, he felt the weight of that truth settle in. Change wasn't a sprint. It was a marathon, a grueling trek through doubt and defeat. Yet every stride mattered. Every meeting, every curriculum approved, every kid who'd grow up knowing their worth. This was the legacy he wanted to leave. A community stitched together by hope, fierce in its compassion, unyielding in its pursuit of what was right. The stars outside his window winked down at him, silent witnesses to a fight that was far from over. And as he kicked off his boots and sank into the worn couch, Elijah knew one thing for certain. Together, they'd keep pushing, keep building, until justice wasn't just a dream, it was the air they all breathed.